I'm awake. So if I could be crying about this financial news, but it could just be still adjusting to the morning.
Okay, great. We are live.
Awesome. So are we ready to get started?
Yes, let's go ahead.
All right, so then is 8:02 and I will call this special finance committee meeting to order. And under the same framework that we've been using for our meetings due to the governor's order during this global pandemic, we will be operating this meeting via webinar. Participants have been invited to watch via the webinar, and all of us are maintaining social distance as we meet digitally. We have just a couple of agenda items today, and this is really the beginning of a conversation. So I'm going to kind of open it up, and then we're going to jump into what is the beginning of a pretty big conversation for our board. I know we've all talked for a long time and over the past few months about the structural deficit and the financial planning that needs to go into righting the ship. Just at the outset, a couple of things that I wanted to note. It is impossible for us to have this conversation without talking about some really big issues that have been hanging over this district for a long time, for generations. When we talk about our fiscal sustainability going forward, we can't ignore the fact that by closing down the Fifth Ward School, we committed this district to decades of transportation costs that are continuing to hang on to us and ask our Black and Brown students to carry the burden of diversity in our schools. We cannot ignore the fact that our buildings are old, many of them, and that as a board, we will have to undertake some education to know what the value of our buildings are, what the lifespan that they have left are, and what it'll take to make them palaces that our children deserve to learn in. We also can't ignore the fact that as we talk about righting the ship, we have to look at our educational investments. So where we put our money, 80% of that, over 80% of that is in people. It's in staffing, but it's also in programs. And as we look to see what gives us, which are educational attainment for students and educational opportunities for students within our school sites, we can't ignore the fact that we're going to have to talk about programs and talk about the staff that we care deeply about. And during this global pandemic, that is just a tougher conversation to have. But this today is a kickoff to a series of conversations. It is not going to be the only conversation. And to our staff, I want to commit, just as we've written into many of the contracts, that this board will not take any decisive action without making sure that we have an opportunity to meet with your union leadership to discuss and hear your concerns as it relates to these conversations. So while this is a public meeting or a meeting held in public, we will engage with you at the appropriate time. And to our broader community, this board is committed to making sure that the community outreach is not you watching this meeting, but rather us taking some specific steps to make sure that we reach out to you to hear your thoughts and to hear your concerns as it relates to our financial planning and our financial future, and get input along the way in this process. And over the course of this meeting and the subsequent meetings, hopefully we will be able to, as a board, agree to a framework with which we can agree to get input from our community and engage forward. Our agenda for today is to talk first about the structural deficit as it relates to staffing, how we staff to meet our educational needs, and have some board ideation on what ideas exist that can be planned and executed for to reduce our spending. We're also going to talk about what our non-negotiables are. So what are the non-negotiables as it relates to the administrative team? What does the administration recommend? We cannot live without. We cannot do this job without. But also as a board, what are things that we think are absolutely imperative as it relates to our equity agenda, as it relates to things that just, again, if without the investment in these parts of our system, we cannot do the job. and talk about the financial shift and a timeline. So what is the time frame with which we plan to make some of the changes or execute some of these plans to become more fiscally responsible and carry forward. And finally, these are the winding down years of the referendum that this community supported several years ago. The referendum dollars have been spent and saved as promised by this board to the community. And our plan is to make sure that we can get the most leverage out of that referendum that we can and be as responsible as possible going forward. So without further ado, are there any questions as it relates to the agenda from any board members? They're big overarching goals. We may not have answers to everything by the end of today, and that's okay because the plan is for this to be an ongoing conversation. Raphael, I know you and Kathy were going to walk us through kind of a quick view that we've seen before about the structural deficit.
Joey, just
We've got a couple slides to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Just before Raphael and Kathy jump on, I just want to make sure that we, as a board also and as administration, really go through the process, ensuring that we're utilizing an equity impact analysis. So really thinking about those 6 questions that ground equity, right? And then work and how we want to embed it. So that's, who's at the table, right? And Joe, you talked about, having community members and all the different stakeholders that are involved in what we do as part of what we do is part of this conversation. And then of course, the making sure that, what the data, which, Raphael and Kathy are going to provide, who is the, who's at the table, and what are unintended consequences, right? So when we think about, you talked about programs and the structural issues around buildings. So I think that's being answered. And then what's going to be the plan going forward, and what and the implementation of how we fix the structural deficit, and then really the plan for implementation, as well as the making sure that we communicate and evaluate how our decisions are being made around the budget. So just making sure that is always part of how we look at budgets, and as well as everything else, because as a board, I think that's something that we've committed to through our policies. I just want to put that out there explicitly.
All right, absolutely. And thank you for saying it, Sergio.
All right, we're ready to queue up, Raphael?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So we just thought you lit the way, Dr. Horton.
Yes. Can you share the screen, Kathy?
Yes. So I'm gonna share the screen. Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep. Yep. So good morning again to everyone. Joey spoke very clearly about our goals around the purpose of this meeting, some of the things that we're going to share, but I just want to make sure today what's going to happen that you'll hear about, which is the most recent financial forecast, projects operating deficit starting for FY23. We've spoken about this several times, but we want to revisit that to make sure that we keep that at the forefront of everyone's thinking as we talk about budget reductions. But if the current economic situation continues to deteriorate, the district, we may experience a deficit year earlier than FY22, which is dangerous for all school districts, but we're D65 and we want to bring that to everyone's attention. It is not a good practice for the district's intention to balance our budget using referendum reserves. Reserves are for rainy days, and I would say, yes, we're in rainy days now, but if we could design our budget that would allow us to move forward now that we have some idea of some of the damage that the pandemic has done and what it can continue to do, we would like to get out in front of that as far as we can and keep our reserves in place. That is a top priority for me as superintendent and the school board, as well as our finance team led by Raphael. And reserves should only be used in extenuating circumstances. We know this is one of them, but we also see that there are other ways that we can do this to keep our reserves in a good position. It's not best practice for us to pull into our reserves to balance our budget. current expenditures must be covered with current revenues. That's a good, healthy way of balancing and living a strong financial life. Despite a balanced budget in FY21, the district will continue to experience a structural deficit in which the costs are growing faster than the revenues. We will go through a few things today, and then we'll also talk about some ideas of how we would like to approach the process with feedback from, of course, our board and the community as well. So, Raphael and Kathy.
So Dr. Horton mentioned a structural deficit, and we've been talking about structural deficit for years now, and it's a phenomenon because even though District 65 has a balanced budget this year, we still have experiencing structural deficit. The rate of growth in our revenues this year is negative, is under 1%, while our expenditures are increasing over 4%. So it's unfortunate that that's affecting almost every single school district in Illinois. Unfortunately, the funding model, and again, we've been talking about it, is stuck against us. I mean, we rely heavily on our local revenues, which is manifested here in this slide. They account for almost 80% of our revenues. And just looking at this slide, we have solo control over our revenues. It's really just a 1% or 1.5% of local fees, student fees, transportation fees, and childcare fees that is sitting in other local revenues. Everything else, it just comes in. I mean, yes, some of those revenues are initiated through claims and grants and so on, but we really have very little control over our revenues. And as far as the expenditures, we are labor-intense operations. As Dr. Horton mentioned, we spend 80% of our expenditures on staffing. Another 3% is special education tuition, cannot touch that. So it leaves us with 17% of non-personnel expenditures, of which most is spent on utilities, transportation costs, other contractual things like the premiums to our co-ops. So unfortunately, if we want to make a difference in our spending and tackle a structural deficit and just any deficit that's coming our way, and we know it's coming next year, the most likely, because we will be revising financial projections, unfortunately, we have to look into our staff.
So the areas that I want to focus on are the real financial pain point that are threatening the district's finances. And some of these issues we have limited control over, but I think it's important for us to share that. The first one that I want to touch on is the failed progressive income tax proposal that failed during the November election. Now, I'm going to start out by saying the state of Illinois' budget that was actually enacted back in March had revenue of $42 billion, close to $43 billion. Of that amount, $5 billion was borrowed. Some of it was borrowed from the federal government. And it also anticipated $3.6 billion that will come from the fair tax, as it's called, the progressive tax, with the expectation that it will pass. But we know that tax did not pass. So there's now a giant hole just in this year's budget from the state of $3.6 billion. Now, if you put that in with the carrying deficit that the state has already, we're looking at the end of this year, the state of Illinois will have a deficit of 13 billion plus, 13 with a B. Now, what the governor has been talking about is at least preliminary of 15% across the board cut in the budget. Now we get the district gets about $8 million from the state in evidence-based funding. Now, what the governor is proposing, that actually comes through, and there's a 15% cut across the board to all entities that receive money from the state. We'll be looking at a cut of at least $1.2 million in our ABF funding this year. So I just want to point that out. So that's big. So we'll have to look this year at cutting another $1.2 billion in this year's budget. Now, another thing on top of that particular issue that we will be considering dealing with is the tax freeze legislation that never died. What that calls for is currently we actually increase property taxes by CPI. That's what the law calls for. CPI of 5%, whichever one is lower. CPI has never hit 5% since PTEL was passed, property tax cap. So what we'll be looking at then, instead of that CPI, which for the 2020 levy that was just brought before the board earlier this month, is 2.3. So if this tax freeze legislation passes, what will happen then is there will be no increase. It will just be fixed. The only increase that we will get will be new properties. So that will be huge on the district. Now, there's also legislation for pension cost shift. As it stands right now, the pension cost for teachers or licensed employee in the state of Illinois are actually borne by the state. The district contributes about 9%. The rest of it is picked up by the state. Now, if this pension cost shift legislation passes, all that is going to move to the district. That will have a catastrophic impact on the district's finances too. I want to touch on that. COVID-19 pandemic, we all know the impact of what that has done to us. Now, in order to make sure that we get school ready for in-person learning, we've been spending money on facility-related expenditures. We bought PPE, and even in remote learning, we've had to spend money on technology and hotspots to provide connectivity assistance to our families. And we've also spent money on things like plexiglasses. We bought portable HEPA filter to help with air filtration for when our students and our staff comes back, and on it goes. And the last thing we just spent money on are portable storage units that we are located in the back of school buildings. With us having to social distance the way we set up classroom, we have extra furniture that we were able to use before COVID that will now have need a place to store. So so when all this is all said and done, the last time we checked the register on this, we're looking at $1.3 million in COVID-related expenses, $1.5 million, I'm sorry, in COVID-related expenses that we didn't plan on before. And there are also revenue that were lost. There were fees that we would have collected by now. A major part of that is childcare fees. We still have the staff on deck, but we're not able to collect those fees. We also have registration fees and lunchroom fees that we've collected. Now, as it stands right now, we're looking at revenue loss of $3.4 million. And there's really no way to get that money back. So those are pressure that are brought on by the pandemic. And to really make things worse, we are not getting that much support from the federal government. If we go back to 2008, when we had the Great Depression, we received a substantial amount of money from the federal government through the ARA funds. What the current administration has provided to us is about $800,000. Of that $800,000, we have to share a chunk of it with private schools. So if you look at all the money that we spent so far, $1.5 million, we've only been allocated $800,000, and we have to share that with private school. That lets you know the kind of financial impact that COVID is having on us. $1.5 million in expenses to date, $3.4 million in revenue lost. The economic fallout of the pandemic, we don't know where it is right now. We know there are some issues. One of the things that we've been able to quantify is the collection rate for property taxes. Normally we get about 99%, but because of COVID and the economic impact of it, we've had to back that down to about 96% collection. And it's possible that the collection rate may even be lower than that. And if that happens, the revenue impact will even be bigger. Okay. And on the overall economy, I want to mention again, a big chunk, like Kathy mentioned, of our revenue source is property tax, clearly 80%. And we depend on CPI in order to be able to catch up, if you will, with increase in revenue. Now, based on what the impact of the pandemic has been, CPI has actually been lower than expected because we know there have been economic fallout from this pandemic. Fewer people are working, fewer people are buying things at the same rate as they would have. So if we look at what CPI has been trending from the time we locked down back in March up to date, we'll be looking at a CPI factor of 1.3 by the end of the year, which will impact the 2021 levy. If you remember what I said earlier, the 2020 levy, we had a CPI factor of 2.3. If the trend that we're seeing now holds through, there will be a whole 1% decrease in CPI factor, which is not a good thing for us. So I'm just going to wrap up this slide by saying that no one knows the long-term economic impact of the pandemic, but we know it's not going to be good. It's going to be challenging for us, which consequently will impact us financially. Dr. Horton.
Okay, I'm gonna have the last two slides. Good. All right, so we will continue to deliver a balanced annual operating budget. That's our goal. We want to continue to preserve referendum funds and educational investments in our children. Seek community involvement is a heavy priority for us. We know that our property taxes are pretty high, and we want to make sure that our community understands and has some involvement in how we move forward with reductions. We want to also implement equitable budget reductions, which protect the district's educational model and its instructional priorities. So next slide. How are we going to, some of the things that we're recommending as far as our process to move forward? We have a budget reduction tool that we'll use. As we heard Sergio speak about at the beginning in a statement, we have two different forms, but using the same process. So one is, as you can see here, this is a process in which, and we got samples. We just put samples in here. So what you'll have with this document, our priorities would be equity centered. If the item is, how does it impact us from an equity lens? If it's about maintaining and monitoring compliance, which a lot of times live heavy and extremely heavy in our business, facilities, and HR department. We'll be using efficiencies, and then program department effectiveness. And so then we will go through a process in which we will be able to gather different programs or even positions, consultants, everything. We want to put it all on the table. And these items will be laid out into this document, and we'll look at what it costs us. And then the way this key works, pretty much, the key works this way. The higher the rating the higher the number we give the category. So if we had a program and we were looking at A under equity, that means that this program does not impact our equity initiative. It doesn't have bearings and puts us in a bad light. So that would get a 3. And if you go down to, let's just look at C under that first category where there's a 2, and we'll have more explanation. We'll have better explanation when we can put some actual action items in here. Or where you see the 0, that means that it is something that we can't touch. So if it's a program or department effectiveness, it has high efficiency and is really effective, then we wouldn't touch it. So for the other side of this, we'll use with our curriculum and instruction, with Dr. Green's department, underlead a little over buildings. We'll use, for those categories that we have for A, B, C, and D, we will use the equity taxonomy language, and we will look at it from an equity lens exclusively, and that more information will come. These are just some things that we wanted to be transparent with how we were finalizing and making those decisions. But before we can get to that, we want to send out a community survey. It'll be developed to solicit input from community members and other stakeholders, and definitely our school board. We know that this is not an easy undertaking, even without it being a pandemic, but to layer the pandemic on top of that is going to be challenging, but we are going to have to make the right decisions as we move forward to putting together a quality, progressive, but much, I don't want to say much, I won't say a much needed budget reduction process for the district. And we will come up with a 5-year layout of how we would like to move forward with that. All right. So I'm going to turn it over and find out, go into questions from our school board members.
Thank you for that opening. Can we stop sharing the screen just so we can all see? There we go. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that rubric and showing the equity taxonomy and how you'll overlay that into the decision-making process. Can we start just from those first 6 slides? Are there any questions from any board members?
I don't have an immediate question. I do have a request in terms of making this accessible for our community. One, can a slide be added with the equity taxonomy in it so that the image is available without being able to hear the entire presentation? And also, can that be linked to the agenda for today so that folks can be directed back to this agenda and be able to pull up that presentation in the case that they can't watch the entire meeting?
Yes, we can add the equity taxonomy language as a different slide. And I'm sure we can link that to the agenda. Adila, correct?
Yes, I'm doing that now.
I would just like to add, given the survey results that we saw on Monday, I'm wondering if we could potentially host focus groups for each school rather than maybe in addition to a survey. I think that it's really important that we share with as many channels as possible. And if we were able to pull in focus groups by schools just to ensure that everyone's voice is heard and that they are aware that these discussions are taking place and have an opportunity to provide feedback to us. So just wanted to add that as a suggestion.
And I think as we talk about the community outreach, Rebecca, I think we need to do it 2 ways. I think there's a difference between the administration holding focus groups at a school site to gather input and us as a board doing explicit outreach to different communities as well. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is the administration is going to need direction from us as a board to make decisions that some of them nobody's going to want to make. And it's going to be our job to be the decision makers there and to provide guidance on between these options that are all bad options. We can afford, X of them. And I think we need to have some outreach to the community as well so that we can understand what people think and feel and make some of those determinations on our own, absent some of our staff doing it. And, some of our staff who go into communities and do a great job. Some of them live in the community and some of them don't. But at the end of the day, we were elected to do this. And I think we need to make sure that we have both things happening in parallel.
Can I think that's exactly right, Joey. And so one of my comments was going to be the community survey is definitely an important tool for us to use, but I do think it can't be the only tool that we use. And going back to Sergio's point about really using the racial equity impact assessment tool, and one of the guiding principles is making sure who we have at the table to help us make these decisions. And I don't know how if we go about creating a board, community budget committee, that we make sure that we in particular include members of historically marginalized groups in that to make sure that we're prioritizing their needs as we think about cuts. I think we can still discuss how we do that, but I do think there needs to be some additional community involvement in giving us some feedback on that. And then the other thing for the presentation, when we're putting it on the linking it to the agenda, which I think is a great idea, Raphael, I just wanted to clarify, and I think it might be worth including this somewhere in the slides. I just want to clarify. We are looking at $1.5 million added to this year's budget in COVID-related expenditures, in addition to $3.4 million in revenue loss for this year?
So to clarify, the budget that was developed included that $1.5 million.
Okay.
That's money that is being spent on pandemic mitigation, if you will, that could have gone to other functions in the district. And the $3.4 million is also reflected in the revenue projection in the budget. The difference is that if we didn't have that loss of revenue, we would have been able to provide more money allocated into the reserve, as was promised during the referendum. For example, during the referendum, there was a promise made that at least $1 million will be put away, if you will, into referendum reserve. But because of the financial stresses brought on by the pandemic, the district would not be able to do that. So this is not additional money per se. This is money that will include in the budget, but for the pandemic, could have been on the expenditure side, could have been used for other things. On the revenue side, could provide a better cushion for the district. Now, the $1.2 million that I mentioned, that is preliminary from Governor Pritzker's statement after he found out that a progressive tax proposal failed. Now, what he's saying is there's now a $3.6 billion hole in current year's state of Illinois budget. His first statement is to say that it will direct all state agency to come back with 15% cut to be able to make up for the difference of the 3.6 that was put into the budget that is now not going to be received. And if that comes through, our share of that, based on the $8 million that the district received in EBF funding, will be estimated to be 1.2 million. And that will take place this year. What it will mean that is we will not receive all that money that we are planning on from EBF.
So that is would affect our current year's budget included that money, and we might have to, that might not be money that we receive this year, correct?
That's correct. Based on
that's not reflected in the
statement, right? That was the governor's preliminary statement. He hasn't put it into action, but I think it's worth us noting and thinking about the implication of it if that becomes reality, because that 3.6 has to come from somewhere, the billion hole that was created by the progressive tax failure.
So I think it's worth including in the slides or in the documentation that we are preparing and trying to make available to the public to have these numbers, to let people understand that these are, these aren't just little sort of marginalized, like fringe costs that maybe we can find somewhere to cut. Like we are talking about millions of dollars. I think it's worth just actually putting those numbers in, as even if they're just estimates right now of what we, and I think including how much we have spent on trying to prepare our schools for, a post-COVID comeback and all the technology. So all the COVID related expenses, I think, itemizing the revenue loss and the potential additional revenue loss from the state. And then, again, also I think highlighting the very small amount comparatively that we received in federal funding. I think all those numbers are important and should be shared.
And I think we're going to need, our next committee meeting is December 9th. And so some of this can't be done overnight. And I'm going to trust Melissa's aesthetic mind when we think about how do we share some of these numbers. But we also need some of our operating expense numbers to be more transparently shared with the community as we think about The cost of valuing and investing in the TWE program and biliteracy for our children. There's a cost for how we do it. And if we're going to look at efficiencies within a program like that, we need to know how much it costs now and how much it's going to cost to do it differently if that's a recommendation that were to come up. And I'm putting that as an example. If we are a district that has chosen to have its own therapeutic school settings for its children, that has a cost to it, and we should identify that cost in a way that's more easily accessible to our community, so that we can define. Sometimes the right decision is more expensive. So these therapeutic schools are important, and they care for some of our most precious children and families, and we should have a cost for what that is, so that as we talk about, if there's a more efficient way to do something, we can compare it to what it costs now to what it will cost to do it differently. Because as you bring recommendations to us, and as you as the admin team stew on what makes the most sense, I think we all generally know what a class size recommendation would do, right? It puts more kids in a classroom, it lessens the number of FTE of classroom teachers. Again, it's an example that people I think generally understand. So we know how much it costs to have X number of people and how much it costs to have 5 fewer. But as we think about programs, we know what our site-based expenses are. We look at that annually. We could put that within this grouping of things. We know how much it costs to operate each building. One of my questions is, do we have the space in all of our school sites to operate with one less building? Right? I'm not saying consolidate buildings, but what if we had enough space to operate with 1 or 2 less buildings? How much does it cost to operate one? And how do we make a decision based on the various points to consider here as a board? But we have to start kind of itemizing what these things are from a curriculum and instruction cost standpoint, right? Programmatically. That also allows us to talk about what our non-negotiables are, right? Do we believe in biliteracy? Do we believe in the two-way immersion program, and that regardless of whatever decision-making comes out of this, we're gonna have that program, and let's make sure everybody understands that from the outset, so don't bother worrying about it. Or from a facility standpoint, right? How much, if we have a school that we spend $500,000 every year just keeping it open because it's falling apart, at what point do we determine whether or not that money is better invested in a new site or an addition or whatever else might be considered? But we have to start thinking about how do people visualize this and take that in on the community site level to be able to engage in this process with us.
Yeah, and I would say along with that, and I think this was implied in your comments, Joey, but I just want to be explicit that when we're looking at what it costs to operate each building and whether or not it's even feasible for us to look at, could we do with one less building? I think we also have to look at, I know we have that master plan of capital needs across each building. I'm not sure when that was last updated, but I think we need to take a look at that again and have an honest look. We know that we have some very, very old buildings that have very, very significant needs. And so before we don't have the money right now to invest in that. So I think that's another thing that we just have to be honest about, like which of these buildings are frankly too old for it to make sense for us to keep, if that's got to be part of the equation as well.
Liz?
I just want to echo that. I think that context is really important. If you tell me program by program, let's decide whether this is staying or going, it doesn't make sense to me. I have to understand, and I think our community needs to understand what the choices are, right? So, we could cut these 42 things, but frankly, we wouldn't solve the problem in any meaningful way. And therefore we still would have this huge structural problem. I think the numbers about building costs and all of these things are really hard to wrap our mind around. And so we need to have it kind of look like a menu of kind of, here's what these costs are, here's what these costs are, here's the things we're considering in each piece so that we can juxtapose them against each other. I think the other thing is we're thinking about providing information to the community is, I do think It's easy to get lost. I'm not a numbers person. It's easy to get lost in all the numbers. So when we talk about structural deficit and we talk about percentages, like, I think we need a number with that, right? That's $2 million a year. That's $5 million a year. That's $40 million a year. Like, what are we talking about in terms of the larger context, so that when we start having to make these decisions and people are having this conversation, and again, as Joey mentioned earlier, it's going to feel like all bad choices. It can't be like, do you want to do this? Well, no. Okay. Like, we have to say, something's got to change. We have to make cuts. Let's decide these things in context. But I think it's really important for people to have more concrete numbers associated with that, because, I don't know how much a particular extracurricular program costs versus how much it costs to update a building as a parent in our community. So I think we need to really put numbers with that for people to be aware of kind of why we're making some of the decisions that we are, and have them be able to give us concrete input as to what they think the priority should be.
Yeah, I know we're talking about efficiencies, and one of the efficiency questions I had was in terms of technology, the technology bucket, and what goes away, what expenses go away when we are post-pandemic, when we all return to school, and what expenses do we want to keep, right? How do we integrate technology into our curriculum going forward and in our instructional practice going forward? So I think there needs to be some intentional planning around that. I think there are some good things about integrating technology that we've seen for some of our students, that it works really well. So how do we do that in a responsible way? But the other thing I wanted to raise is, in one of the slides, I was reviewing one of the presentations, the budget presentations that Kathy and Raphael provided a few months back. And there was some recommendations, and one of them was a culture of fiscal conservatism. And I wanted to have us think about that and what that means, right? What does that mean in the ongoing process of practice in putting together budgets and negotiating contracts? What is assumed to be automatic, right? And what is assumed to be, what are expectations about what's just going to happen, right? And I think we really need to question those assumptions and what's automatic. So I just want to bring that up, because I think that is going to, we can look at efficiencies now and look at cuts now, but I think we really need to look at long-term ongoing process and practice, right? About what's assumed and what's not.
Anya?
So I had a couple of thoughts. One, 4 years ago, when we were having the discussion about the referendum, we had a discussion about reductions in force. And at that time, what was presented was the orchestra program. And many of the folks that we heard from were stakeholders in the orchestra program, and they presented many different ideas about how to make the orchestra program more efficient and cost effective. And I think the lesson from that is for us to think intentionally of how we include community stakeholders, but also programmatic stakeholders, in order to learn about the specific numbers in terms of costs, but also think about where efficiencies could be built in order to avoid potential unintended consequences of our decisions. And that's the incredible value and blessing of having stakeholder voice, is to be able to be thoughtful about what are the potential lived experiences and consequences of these really high level discussions. So I want us to be intentional as a board in how we proceed following these discussions to engage with our community and with our stakeholders within our institution, so that we can be well-informed and thoughtful about our guidance and decision-making. I think that I also want to highlight the levels of interdependence of all of our discussions and decision making. We are a interwoven network of individuals and programs and experiences as an institution, and no one reduction or cut is going to touch just one thing. And I think that knowledge has to, and that understanding has to be a part of this discussion. That it's important that we stay as far away from student experiences as possible. And I appreciate that rubric metric for program and department effectiveness, which I think includes impact on classroom. But everything is connected. We are all connected with each other as a community, and everything in our schools is connected as well. And so, this is a heavy conversation because we are talking about changes in experiences. And for some people, changes in beloved experiences. For some people, not as much. But we're going to have to hear from stakeholders and be really thoughtful in this discussion so that we can be clear about impact. The last thought in terms of accessibility and engagement is how we make our materials available in Spanish. This discussion is not happening in Spanish. At the very least, our materials can be in Spanish, and we can also be very intentional about having focus groups and outreach plans that specifically are inclusive of our Spanish bilingual community, as well as the many multilingual communities in our community. So I think those are two thoughts that I wanted to highlight for our discussion.
Is there a reason we can't provide these conversations with translation? We've had different times where we've had someone on a different channel translating. Is that possible for some of these financial discussions?
Yes, it's possible. Melissa, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I could talk a little bit. Adila might have a little bit more context than I do. I think that it was just a financial challenge. We looked at the cost of providing translation during outside business hours, so when staff wasn't working. Right now, we have a significant translation need in the district. We're having a really difficult time meeting the need and expectations for providing a great deal of information in both English and Spanish, and we're just truly limited with one district translator on staff. We've set an expectation, I think the board has, I think our administration has, in providing information and making sure that it's accessible in multiple languages, but sort of like the structural deficit, the demand is outweighing the resources that we have. So I'm actually currently working with the bilingual services department now, and we're trying to get really creative about how we can provide additional translation resources and tap into some additional staff members in the district through our desk group. So we're working with Beatrice and Raphael on that and are hoping to be able to, again, get creative as to how we do that. But in all honesty, I think it was just truly an expense that we have to make that decision on going forward.
I think we have to shift our conversation from if to how. I don't think this is anything that we can, I see this in a lot of different structures within our district of it. It is often an afterthought, or it is, not, I'm not Melissa, we haven't given you the budget. I'm not saying that you have the resources to do what you need to do, and I know it's hard for us to talk about adding resources when we're talking about cutting resources, but with the priorities in our district and serving our community, I would personally say this is a non-negotiable that we need to figure out.
And
And
to
I
that-
would love,
I'll echo that. I got to tell you that again, if we want families to be informed about how their children are doing, right, and being advocates for the outcomes of the children, particularly, and I not only think about being from Dawes, right? We have folks who speak Creole, Haitian Creole, Jamaican Patois. I mean, we have folks from the Middle East. I'm wondering if the district can maybe put out to bid or maybe get some maybe some quotes from a couple of different language translation services to see if there's any good pricing. Again, given that I know we have one person who's doing translations for the district, but if you guys maybe look at different translation services that are out there across the state, and then maybe even collaborating with some of the organizations that service some of our migrant refugee families, right? So reaching out to the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, they may, I'm sure, know folks who may want to do some of these services at a pretty decent cost. Again, just trying to be creative and also cost saving at the same time, and really trying to leverage possible, just making sure that there's different price quotes that you guys get, and then even reaching out again to some of the refugee serving organizations out there would be a start, I think.
Thank you.
and I would
And
say let's get,
And I want to make sure that I think the push to do this a little bit better and have the outreach is there, but I want to make sure that we're efficient with our time on the finance topics. So hopefully that's noted as a future need that we want to try to find a solution for. To that point around the budget, and some of the ways that we're going to be able to make decisions here are going to need to be, we might have to spend some money to get the information we need to make decisions. For example, an architecture engineering study or an appraisal study of our buildings. How do we as a board know which buildings have more life in them? If you tell me that we have a building that has 30 years left of good life, I want to know that versus one that maybe within 5 years is doom and gloom. Right? Well, we know we've got buildings that every year leak when we get a heavy rain, and all these things. So I don't want to speak on our current architecture firm, but if that's the group that needs to do it, or if we need to put out a bid to see who can do it and do it well with our many sites, if that's something we need to do, we need to know what that cost is as a board to know whether it's worth investing in, to know what they're going to give us, and they might need to come and present to us what that looks like. We have like 5 more minutes in this meeting. This is a beginning conversation. I see the hand on you, but if we're going to spend some money somewhere in this process, we need to know what that's going to look like. I think we need to know how many staff we have in how many bargaining units and roles and responsibilities by category. I think as a board, we have a lot of education in this realm that we're going to want to dive into. And the public can see a reference on the agenda to 2x2s. It's written into our public agenda, just so everyone knows that's a format that's used for board members to get education by department on certain things. It's not meant to subvert the public conversation in this process. No more than 2 board members might meet with Dr. Horton or might meet with Beatrice in HR to ask questions around this process and do our due diligence. And just so you know, the reference of that is in between this meeting and the next meeting, there's a desire for us as a board to have access to cabinet members to ask some more detailed questions so that the next meeting can be continuing on in this conversation. Anya?
Yeah, the other thought that I had was I feel like it would be useful for our community to understand some of the causes for the structural deficit and the debt burden that we are currently affected by. And some of that the cause and the history of that is context that lives with previous iterations of our school board. Sunny, I think you gave me some context about a financial meeting that you all had where you learned that the debt service had been exhausted. Maybe 7 years ago or so, where y'all learned at the finance meeting that the debt service had been exhausted. And so I think, you know, we have tried to build back our reserves, right? But there are some financial positions that the district is in for decisions that were made 20 years ago that we're still experiencing the consequences for. And I think it would be helpful to have that information available for public consumption so that we understand the context that we're operating in. Sunny, I don't know if if you had anything to add to that description or if I captured it accurately.
I think that was good.
And so kind of to close this meeting, my ask for the admin team is to think about the low-hanging fruit. There are things that you know we can do, and there's things, and I'd like to spend a few minutes as a board talking about things that we think we can do that are not going to touch the kids. I'll throw some out that are off the top of my head that I want to be considered. I know that it's wonderful that all of our elementary schools start at the same time of day and the middle schools start at the same time of day. But I also know that there are institutions that have schools as many as ours that if they stagger the start times at schools by neighborhood, they don't need as many buses. They don't need as many bus routes. And so you don't need, the transportation cost doesn't need to be 4 million a year, but maybe 3 million a year. You know, I'd like for that to be considered because while it changes the people's schedules, it doesn't change people's experience, right? There are, there are circumstantial savings that are happening now because of COVID. While we're spending in other places, we're also not spending in some places. And what are we doing with that money? Is there an offset? I would love to know the list of things that we might be able to do, now. Immediately, because it doesn't touch people's experience to move forward. The transportation was just one of them. I know that we've got the TWE program, and we've talked about a lot. We've opened up the TWE strands at Bessie Roads. The efficiencies there. I want the TWE program in the district. I just want to know if it's as efficient as it can be. Because I also know the experience of having single strands in some buildings is isolating for communities and also exhausts transportation. And if we can have people more closely attending schools near their homes, I want to know that. I also know that if we look at bilingual and biliteracy research, I know that we stop instructing with fidelity, and this isn't a complete fair statement, but by 5th grade, the program kind of stops. How do we get biliteracy through 8th grade so that children actually do reach a level of literacy that says that we do value them learning 2, 3, 4 languages? What are some non-negotiables or ideas for this board that the admin needs to take away before our next meeting to think about? For me, the schedules was just something that was definitely on my mind. Are there any ideas that you all have that you came to the meeting with, possibly? Suni.
Yeah, I mean, I think schedules is definitely one. Staggered start times is an important one to consider. And I think, we have always kind of touched around this, but, are our boundary lines as efficient as they could be? And should we be looking at rethinking that so we're reducing transportation costs?
Thank you.
I wanted to add that we now know how to do school differently. We know how to do synchronous and asynchronous learning. So what does that mean? And, to add to Sula's and Joey's comment around technology or being able to study, I think that this is the best time for us to analyze what is the cost per student for technology. That's not going away. It needs to be included. It's part of the infrastructure, like textbooks, as part of our operation. So what does technology look like moving forward, and how do we ensure that we can provide that for our students going forward, and that they have access? And I do think the public can't see this, but we SUNY referenced being able to have a conversation with our government agencies and large institutions. And so we've had this conversation around citywide internet, right? So how do we get some cost savings in being able to share an expense with any of these large institutions? So just wanted to add that. And from the COVID learnings, I think, what did we learn from that in terms of delivery and the workforce that we actually need to provide the services that our students are going to need moving forward, with technology included as a very vital part of that equation.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I second the interest in taking a hard look at transportation costs and thinking about what are the changes that can be made to reduce those. And I think that it has many different benefits. One, the potential for the marginalized, racially and ethnically marginalized people of our community being able to be educated more closely to home. And I think there's the benefit also of reducing the impact on our environment and reducing our costs. There's many benefits, but we spend a lot on transportation, and the quality of it is consistently questioned. And so I think that it's a prime area to look at. The other thing that I think is really important is us keeping in mind the broader experience that children are having, both academically and socially and emotionally, and the wholeness in human development that our institution invests in, and holding value and priority for investing in the whole child and the whole family. I think, we're investing resources into having teams of folks who can have meaningful relationships with families and make families feel a sense of belonging and a sense of care and commitment from our district. That goes a really long way for kids and families for our community. And that is an important value.
Thank you.
I think also last time when we were having conversations about reductions in force, we were given options as a board that were not, I think they were intentionally unpalatable. However, we were presented orchestra or ACC. And I think, ACC and two-way immersion are programs that are meant to serve marginalized populations and also uplift and represent marginalized populations and voices. And I think the equity taxonomy will name that when those programs are being looked at. But that is important to me for us to be considerate and protective and not look at programs that may seem marginal because they are serving marginalized populations as low-hanging fruit. I think, we have to be intentionally protective of those resources.
Thank you. Can we also identify the grant-funded programs, things that are not, that fund themselves because we apply for and receive the grants? People might think like, oh, let's talk about, Head Start, early childhood programming, because they're not, we're not required to have it, but we also we take in a lot of grant monies to fund some of these things. So I want to make sure that we identify those things as self-sustaining or at least self-funding via the mechanisms that which the money comes in.
I just wanted to name one other thing from my experience at the board level is that a lot of opportunity has been lost in our district due to maybe lack of systems. That's what I want to name, lack of systems. And systems effectiveness and efficiency often is reliant on people and resources and attention. And I think one of the things that I really don't want to see is chaos for children, especially given the amount of trauma that this year has due to lack of leadership at the federal level, has really lobbed upon local institutions and then on individual families. We need reliability. We will need consistency. We'll need some predictability in our systems. And I certainly don't want to see us not be resourced at a level that will be able to maintain those important elements given the trauma that we've all survived this or are surviving currently.
I want to just say thank you all. This is good feedback for our team as we begin to continue to, I guess, embark on this journey of creating a really quality budget reduction process moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. And while our next meeting is scheduled for December 9th, I think I'll speak for myself when I say it's more important to me that the process is done right and methodically than that it's rushed together. You know, I think as a board member, I don't want recommendations from the administrative team before we've taken them also to the community in some way and figured out our community outreach. So one of my end goals for December 9th is for us to know what is our action plan post December 9th for us as an admin team, but also as a board team to engage with stakeholders and ask them what they think about this problem and give us advice and consent or not around what it is that they value as community members who experience these programs. So thank you for the work in between, and for board members. We've talked in planning for today with Dr. Horton and Raphael. I think any question that you have can be sent asking to gain understanding, but the reference to the 2x2s in the agenda, I think we'd like to set up some time for people to ask more questions and to gain further insights and to dig deeper, you know, to sit with Stacy and talk about the instructional programs and how those are funded, right? And what they are. And, you know, we all have experiences based on our experiences in the district as community members and parents, but there's also parts that we don't see and experience, and to kind of hear more about the what, the how, and the why that they exist. So that is something that look for more information to get invited to some opportunities to hear from cabinet members around how their programs are funded.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions before we adjourn for today? Thank you all for making the time at such an early hour. And we will adjourn this Finance Committee meeting at 9:10.
Have a good day.